Welcome to the Game Design for Student Success webinar series. It is 3 o'clock, so we're going to get started. Thank you again for joining us. All right, so this is the third in our series. So today we will be talking about progression and flow. I am Candace Best, your presenter for today's webinar, and before we get started, I will just review our standard housekeeping announcements. This is being recorded and will be available shortly after the end of the live broadcast on our broadcast page and on YouTube. Please share this information with your colleagues and invite them to register so that they can receive their own notifications of the next and reminders of the next webinar that we will hold next week. You are free to and invited to please post comments below on our broadcast page. Again, that link is sent to everyone who registers. Okay, hold on. What is happening? Just pause for 1 second. I want to make sure you can hear. I'm receiving looks like we have some technical difficulty. Okay, I think we are back now. All right. Thank you. All right, so as I was saying, you can post your comments on our broadcast page at the URL for our site. And again, please visit us if you haven't registered so that you can receive that information. That URL will be persistent, so you'll be able to watch the rebroadcast at any time. Live tweeting is encouraged. And finally, Brooklyn Bingo is simply our way of acknowledging that we are broadcasting from Brooklyn. And the likelihood that you will hear a horn or a siren is pretty good. So if you are registered, so you must be registered for the webinar and you must be viewing us on our live page. But if you hear a horn or a siren during the course of the live broadcast only, and you type in Brooklyn Bingo in the comment section below, we will send you a gift card. So with that, let's jump right in. So objectives for today's webinar are to describe the function of progression as its own game design principle. We're going to build on the previous session, the loops and arcs session, to describe how they fit into a progression scheme and how the three work together. We'll evaluate opportunities to build progression into your educational goals, whatever they may be, whether they are course, domain related, or program related. We'll talk about them from all of those perspectives. We're going to spend some time talking about Csikszentmihalyi's flow model, because that is a model that is used by a lot of game designers to frame their objectives for keeping students engaged and frame their strategy for keeping their players engaged. We'll then apply that model to higher education, talk specifically about why it's relevant and how to think about it when you start thinking about applying game design principles to your objectives. And then we'll wrap it up by connecting all of that to the GDSS, the Game Design for Student Success model. So we'll revisit that model. We didn't talk about that model in the last webinar, but we did in the kickoff webinar, where we will revisit it again to see how it links together with these principles that you're going to be learning today. So let's start with a quick recap of what has been covered in our previous webinars to set context for what we're going to talk about today. So as you know, I use this metaphor of the 6 simple machines of game design: narrative, loops, arcs, progression, constraints, and emotions. We covered loops and arcs in the previous webinar, and today we're going to cover progression. On the previous webinar, I also shared with you the Game Design for Student Success design canvas as a tool that you could use to start playing around with what we covered last week, starting to create your own loops and connecting them to arcs. So this is going to continue to be relevant to our conversation today and put that in broader context. So if you don't have that design canvas, it can be downloaded directly from the broadcast page for last week's webinar, and you can contact us if you are registered. Just find that link. It's the same link that was in the invite. If you are just registering for the first time and you didn't receive it, you can certainly email us and we will make sure you get that link. So progression is the system of movement that defines the structure of the game. And the definition of an arc, for example, an arc is unidirectional progress towards mastery. And so the fact that it relates to progress um, might beg the question, so how does progression differ from an arc? Well, progression is the overarching concept that connects loops and arcs and allows players to move to mastery. But what I also distinguish progression with is this focus on investment. That it's not just random movement from one loop to the next or from one task to the next, but that it's movement that requires the player to be invested. And it is that investment that really solidifies or makes salient the perception or the feeling of making progress. So it's essential to the notion of progression. And that's why that's a big focal point for what we're going to learn about as we talk about loops, arcs, and progression and how they go together. These three principles out of the 6 are really the core elements of a deliberately designed game design approach, as opposed to just mechanics, which we talked about in the kickoff webinar, and which we'll talk a lot more about in the next webinar. So what progression does is progression allows you to start designing with the end in mind. If you recall from the previous webinar when we spoke about loops and arcs, one of the things we talked about was that loops are very discrete tasks. It's one task per loop, and then you connect those loops together into arcs to start moving towards an objective. However, when you have really broad objectives, like graduating from a 4-year degree, that's too long a process to be effective in one arc. So that's what we refer to as a major arc, but that yet still is going to be a very tangible goal. In fact, if you're interested at all in game design to achieve student success objectives, those objectives usually are going to be those big, grand objectives. And when we spoke, what we covered last webinar, with loops and arcs, really we're talking about small chunks towards that big goal. Now with progression, we get to talk about the big goals. So again, like graduation, if you're at a 2-year college and you're thinking, how do we get more of our students to move from 2-year to 4-year? How do we get fewer students to drop or fail or withdraw from courses, especially if those are courses that are gateway courses or really essential to them meeting their educational objectives? How do we improve those outcomes? How do we just get students to be more active, to participate more in what's going on? How do we do those things? Those are big, bold goals, big, broad goals that typically cannot be achieved, certainly cannot be achieved from a single loop. And they probably can't be achieved from a minor arc that is condensed enough for participants, for the students in our case, to really feel progress. They're going to require a series of minor arcs that are linked together to move us towards those goals and segmented into sections. And that is what progression allows us to plan for, to think about. So in order to do that, so as we're thinking about the broader canvas of what we want to accomplish for our students when we take a game design approach, and again, distinguishing progression from the other 2 principles by focusing on investment, then the first question we have to ask is, well, what are the investments that are required? What is it that we need students to contribute? And I want to pause here for a second to make a point that I've made perhaps here in this webinar series, and certainly in other talks that I've given and presentations that I've given on designing approaches for student success. Very often in higher ed, those of us who are passionate about higher ed and really want to improve outcomes for students who currently aren't enjoying great outcomes, we spend a lot of time thinking about changes that we can make as educators to make things easier and better for students. And certainly it's a laudable goal to want to improve the student experience. That's never a bad thing. The concern I have, though, is so much of these conversations and these plans and these designs are taking place without the student. Right? So the student may be even center in our mind. That certainly is our goal for what we want to do. But we're trying to design systems without acknowledging that there's just no way we can achieve success, or a student can't achieve a success if they're not a part of the process. So while that may seem obvious once you state it out loud. When you are trying to design a process that will improve outcomes for students, the investment, the things that they're going to have to do, what they're going to have to contribute needs to be a deliberate part of the design. And so thinking of it in terms of what are the investments that are required, independent of the student. What do we know about what it takes to complete calculus? What do we know about what needs to happen in order for a student to be eligible to move from 2-year to 4-year? What is it going to take for us to have students participate in these activities and actually get something out of it? What do we need from them? What do they need to do? What is the quality of their investment that is required for them to actually achieve the benefits that we've built into or that we anticipate coming from those experiences? So that's one. And then once you've identified the investments, and it's going to probably be many, then what the game design process, by mapping out using these loops, these arcs, and this progression, allows us to start looking at is what is preventing the student from making that investment. At what point, if we map out the steps that we want students to take that will lead them to success, at what point are they not moving to the next loop? Are they not moving to the next task? What's keeping them from moving? Because that's typically going to be the point where they either will drop out of the system or they'll drop out and no longer be benefiting or making progress, or they're at risk of dropping out. And so if we think about it in terms of each little loop is a step closer to that goal that students are moving towards, what is keeping them from making that next step? What is keeping them from making the investment necessary for them to be able to make that next step? So that brings us to Csikszentmihalyi's flow model, which I think is a really good place to dig down. If we think in terms of investment, it's a good parallel because what we're really talking about in a higher education setting is something that we are asking students to do, a challenge we're presenting. So if you see in this model, the vertical axis is defined as the challenge level, and the horizontal axis, is the skill level. So in other words, challenge, what we're asking them to do, and skill, their ability to do it. Now, game designers use this model because it's this swath in the middle that goes from the lower left-hand corner to the upper right-hand corner becomes this sort of channel that we want to keep the player in. That's called flow, right? And so what Csikszentmihalyi's model does is it identifies all of the areas outside of that channel, that flow stream, that cause players, in this case, when it's applied to purely game design, causes players to drop out. But it's very much parallel to education. But first, let's just look at it in the form that it's presented. What we're seeing here is that at the lower left side, if the challenge being presented to a player, or in our instance, a student, is too hard, too fast, so it's much harder than their ability to meet that challenge, then we see moving to a high level of anxiety and a likelihood that this player or the student will quit out of frustration. On the horizontal axis, if the student or player is not challenged at all, so the more they play, the better they may be, but they're never challenged to get any better, then they're often going to quit then because they're bored, because it's not challenging enough and they're not interested enough. Certainly from a player standpoint, if you look at it purely from designing a game, if it's the same thing over and over again, I'm getting really good very quickly, but I'm never being challenged to do more. So now I've become really good at this, but it's never any more interesting. Again, I'm bored. I'm out, right? So looking at the challenge of maintaining flow is really how do we keep the skill and the challenge level balanced so that the player continues to be engaged. So now let's look at this from the perspective of education. Part of the challenge that we have in higher education is that we don't, if you really think about it, nothing in education is designed with this kind of balance in mind. At any given point, a student may experience a lot of challenge and not be ready, or be bored. They may experience that alternating, that may be an alternating experience that happens within a class or across classes. So I might have one class that I'm doing really well in. I might have another class where I'm not doing well at all. And I quickly, reach a level of anxiety. And those are the classes. If I go to 2 sessions and it doesn't get any easier, that's the class where I drop. That's a class where I quit. Or I go to a student organization. I get invited to attend some event and I find it boring, and so I don't go anymore. I go to a student activity where the idea of having this activity was so that I'd feel more connected to the school and that I make friends, but it just doesn't interest me. It's not challenging me very much, but it's not requiring a high level of skill, but it's also not something that I see any immediate benefit from. I don't go back. I drop out on the other end. So at any given time in higher education, this back and forth is happening without necessarily any deliberate design on how to manage the challenge and the skill so it continues to be engaging. Staying with the class in particular, if we think about a really challenging class, as educators, do we think about how we're presenting that material in such a way that the challenge and the skill level is constantly balanced and in tension? Some faculty members, I'm sure, do a great job. Others of us may not be doing a great job just because we never thought about it that way. So let's move to a more deliberate walking through of each of these grids to think through with more specificity what the challenges and what the opportunities are. The first point that I want to make very clearly, and again, whether we're talking about a course content or we're talking about attendance or participation in a program or just navigating the bureaucracy of a particular campus, any and all of those things could be barriers to students making progress. The one starting point that I think is helpful in applying this model to education is remembering that we always start in the lower left-hand corner, meaning every time a student is confronted with something new that they have not experienced before in our educational setting, they are starting from a point of apathy. So if we make that our universal starting point when we're trying to design a new project or an approach, starting with this understanding, they're always starting brand new from a point of apathy. What that means is they don't know what they're supposed to be doing, or they don't know what they're supposed to know, and or they don't care. Let's pause on that for a second. They start out not knowing, right? So they don't know. From a game design point, if you think about it practically, the first time you play a game, you don't know what you're supposed to be doing in that game. You don't know what's going to be asked of you, but you also don't really care. Part of a game designer's challenge, and this is again why these principles could be really useful to us in education. Game designers understand that. Game designers go into it understanding, I've got to first convince this player, if I can get it in front of them, that this is worth their time to play. I have to get them to think, at least try it, because not only do they not know what to do, why would they care? This is, if we approach education that way, especially higher education, we have to first get over ourselves, but recognize how offensive some educators might think that this approach is. It requires us to understand and accept that as a student comes into our class for the first time, they know nothing about this subject matter, right? But they're being forced to take it in many instances, whether it's because it's a program requirement or maybe it's just an elective that they need to take to get that much closer to graduation. What does it do to our ego as educators or psyche to look at those 5 or 10 or 25 or 100, depending on the class you're teaching students, and recognize that, see them as 100 students or 50 students or 10 students who don't know anything about what I'm going to teach them and don't really care, that I then have to figure out a way to get them interested in enough to want to continue on this journey. Some educators will find that offensive because they will think, well, I'm not here to sell you on what I'm teaching. If you're not ready to be engaged on your own, then you don't belong here. That is certainly within their right to have that position. But again, if what we're talking about is designing systems for student success, then it requires us to step back and take the approach that a game designer would take and say, okay, I'm going to start from the position that not only does this new student not know, but also doesn't care about why they're being asked to do this. From here, from this starting point, we have 2 paths. And this is where it becomes even more aligned with higher education, because the reality is, and let's start with just courses. Students register for a course for a reason, because they need it or they believe they need it to graduate, which means that unlike a game where a student can download a game or a player can download a game on their phone, they can download it and never play it. They can download it, open it, take a look at it, think it's stupid and not play it. A student, meaning they never start the journey. And that's why game designers are so hyper focused on that very first experience, where we aren't necessarily, because if the student registered, there's something that required them to register. So they're going to start, they're going to take at least a step or two on this journey of whatever you're asking them to do. The next step, though, is either what you're going to ask them to do, now they realize they don't know, and now they start to care, because now they're conscious of the fact that, oh, okay, this is what this takes. I'm not sure I can do this. This is when we start moving up the challenge side, or you've asked them to do something that they can do. So they know some, but don't care to learn more, meaning, all right, I think I got this, but I'm not particularly engaged in it. So I'm only going to go as far as I absolutely have to. It's important for us to think about both of these trajectories, because while a lot of our attention tends to be focused on students who are struggling and may drop out, you'll see in a second why I think we also do ourselves a disservice and the students a disservice if we don't think about students who they're passing the classes, but they're not engaged. So the next level is if a student is continuing to feel challenged beyond their ability to master it, so their skill level with whatever is being asked of them continues to be low, but the demands continue to raise. This is when it turns into, they know that they don't know. They're very aware of the fact that they're not getting what is being asked of them. They're not able to do what is being asked of them. And now they don't think they're ever going to be able to do it. They're not going to be able to learn. This is when students are at greatest risk of quitting. Let me pause here and say that this too is not exclusive to just courses. It's immediately apparent to us when we think about high DFW courses. Math was never my strong suit. I enrolled in calculus. I did not understand what the professor said on day one. When I came back on 2, I didn't understand. I'm dropping this major. I'm doing something different. I just can't get this. Okay, so we recognize that. But also think about the student who just doesn't feel like they fit in. That's another reason why a student will leave. I don't know how to do this campus. I don't know how to fit into this culture. I don't know that college is for me. I'm a first-generation student, and everything about this experience is so overwhelming that not only do I now realize that being a college student takes more than I thought, I don't know that I'm ever going to be able to manage it. So again, this is not limited to just courses, although it's readily apparent in courses. This is anything that is going to cause a student to believe this may not be for me. I've always maintained that all students quit for the same reason. They quit because they don't believe they fit in. Now, why they don't believe they fit in may be different. They may believe they don't fit in because the level of rigor is higher than they're exposed to, or they don't believe they fit in because they don't see enough students or faculty that look like them culturally and they don't feel like they fit in, or there could be any number of reasons, or they thought that they wanted to go to a big school, but it's just too many people and they feel anonymous, or the school is too small, they don't feel challenged. There could be any number of reasons, but it's always the same. If it feels too much like something that they just can't do, they just don't fit in, that's why they quit. So we have this high level of anxiety. On the other end of the spectrum, and this is again the student that I think we tend to overlook, everything is easy. They get through all of the classes. Think about the student who 3.9, 4.0, but all they do is go to class. They don't participate in any student organizations. They haven't done any internships. All they've done is go to class, whether they have really great grades or average grades. They've figured out how to master being a student. This is the student who is at risk of graduating with a degree, not being able to find a job, because their whole experience has been one-dimensional. They can't get recommendations from faculty because they never built any relationships with faculty. They don't have a strong peer network because they never participated in anything. Our commuter students are at high risk of this. Our adult learners coming back are at high risk of this. This is not a judgment. There's always reasons why they do it, but many of these students, many first-generation students who have to work to put themselves through school, see anything outside of class as something frivolous that they don't have time for because they're just here to get their degree. And maybe they got good grades, and yet they finish and they can't find a job, or they can't find a better job than the one that they had, because there's nothing that their experience in college has changed or proven that they can do other than pass classes. This is the student, right? So they know well, their credential says they know well, but they not only do they perhaps not care to use what they've learned, they don't know how to use what they've learned because they've not had a diversified experience. And this is the student who may leave college and then question why did they bother to go. They can't see how anything's different in their life. They're paying off the student loan. They've got this credential, but they still can't get a job. So if we don't think about how to translate meaning into the experience that students are having, then we're talking about students who stay at the skill level. They've got a credential that says that they have more skill, but they really weren't ever challenged to use it. So where do we want to go from here? We want students to be in the middle, right? So the student who is actually feeling challenged is feeling a high degree of challenge in what is being asked of them, and they may be struggling with it, but it's being balanced enough with skill that it moves to arousal, meaning they know some. Now they're starting to improve their skill level, and it's being presented to them in a way that they want to know more. On the other side, know well and want to master, they've always been doing well, but we've presented this experience in a way that now encourages them to want to master this experience, the whole experience, whether it's the knowledge in a particular course or the mastery of becoming a college-educated professional, or same could be true at the graduate level or the doctoral level. It's the same process. They are integrating their experience, their educational experience with their whole self. That to me is what a game design approach to education represents, because ultimately, if we're keeping them in that channel, we're moving all the students towards a commitment to mastery, a commitment to not just getting a grade. And I'm going to talk about that, how grading and those kind of external rewards undermines flow from an educational standpoint. Flow educationally means keeping them in this state where they are consciously committed to achieving mastery. So this is another way of looking at it. Again, as I said, we start with all students, all of our players in our education, our game design for student success, all start at apathy. Whatever it is that you are introducing them to for the first time, your class, your subject, the major, the campus, the program, whatever it is, the first time they're introduced to it, they're at mastery. You are trying to keep them in that channel of flow, moving them from apathy to arousal to flow, which flow representing staying in that channel until they achieve mastery. So here's the game design for student success model that was presented to you in the kickoff. What this is a standard template. One way to think about it now that you've been introduced to those three core elements: loops, arcs, and progression. This could be looked at as a template for a mini arc. That is, a mini arc is a series of connected loops that will be connected to another arc en route to a major arc and en route to a broad goal. And the point here is that this illustrates, specific to education, one, that our starting point is apathy on the lower left side. So the first thing that we have to do is we have to meet first with discovery. Now, again, if it's a course that the student has to take, the discovery is taken care of for you. They know they have to have certain types of courses. And so this course meets that requirement. They don't know what they're in for. They don't know what they're going to be asked to do. But in terms of discovery, they've discovered it because it's been presented to them as something that they need to do. But if it's a student organization that you want them to join, if it's a program that they may benefit from, if it's tutoring, for example, it's voluntary, you know they would benefit from it, but they haven't gone. If there's an organization around a particular interest that you think would keep them more engaged, would help them to see. On one of the podcasts, on our podcast that we do, I have an interview coming up with the coordinator of the Ball State Achievement Apps, and he talked about how his first few experiences with college didn't go well, but it was only once he was introduced to a program that really sparked his interest that it made him want to come back. And the third time he came back to college, he was successful because he was introduced to it in a different way. That's all discovery, right? So that's our starting point. What the game design for student success model then says, the next thing you have to think about is first contact. So when they're first introduced to program, topic, dorm, whatever it is, the first contact sets the stage for how they're going to perceive the work to be done and whether it's worth it for them to invest. Remember, progression, we're always thinking about investment. Is it worth it for them to continue to invest? And then if you can keep them, if you can get them to answer that question, yes, then they're primed to be onboarded, to be introduced to this increasing level of challenge that they're going to be exposed to in a way that keeps that balance that we're looking for, keeps them engaged enough so that their skill level is matching the challenge. And then eventually when we get to habit building, they can continue that investment on their own with less support and less structure. And that eventually leads to mastery. So the game design for student success model. Now, hopefully you're seeing that it's really a template for how to think about connecting loops and arcs together in route to progression as a part of a progression scheme. So when we talk about commitment to mastery, because that's ultimately what flow represents, a commitment to mastery, what are we talking about? It could be just a commitment to the coursework. If it's an individual class and it's just do all the homework, do all the reading, because if you do those things, you're likely to be more successful. So commitment to coursework. That commitment to coursework is en route to the broader arc of mastery of domain knowledge in that subject matter. So if it's your major, so you're going to take some courses that are elective, but you're also going to take some courses that are part of a major. The whole reason why majors are designed the way they are is because they're supposed to represent domain knowledge, right? So if we have students who are continuing, if we have students who shoot right up the vertical axis, and so they hit the top of anxiety and they drop out. These are the students who start out in a major and they fail out, and now they've got to change majors and they're at risk of spending more than 4 years to graduate because they've got some credits they can't use, or they're floundering, or they don't pick a major, or they're confused because it was too hard too fast. Conversely, you could have students who are doing well. They just ride along that horizontal axis. So they've taken all the courses, but have they really mastered the domain? Not if they were never engaged. Not if we didn't keep them in that channel of flow, because then they were never interested enough to think about mastering the knowledge. At best, they were just thinking about, how do I continue to get A's so I have this 4.0? So we're talking about mastery of domain knowledge, which ultimately translates into mastery of those core college level abilities: critical thinking, problem solving, communication. Again, we may give assignments in every course that are supposed to reflect that. But if a student isn't truly committed to that core belief, if they're just getting by to get the grades, then they're not committed to mastery of college level abilities. And then they can graduate with a credential, but not really have the education. So are we designing deliberately around that? Experiential learning, commitment to mastering transfer of all of this knowledge that we're getting in the classroom into skills that we can take out of college and into the workforce. That's ultimately what our students want. Greater than 90% of college students see their college degree as a pathway to a stable, good, productive, successful job that will allow them to meet their needs and meet their aspirations. And so to the extent that you ever have students graduating, and we have lots of students graduating, saying that they don't know why they went to college, or people telling them you don't need to go to college, it's not valuable anymore. Conversely, when you have employers of college graduates saying that they're not coming in with career-ready skills, all of that is a symptom or an indication that we may not actually have, we may have designed beautiful curriculum, but we have not designed a process that has students committing to mastery of these areas: domain knowledge, college level abilities, and transferable skills. And that is part of the promise and the potential of taking a game design approach to student success. So with that in mind, let's look at the design canvas again. Now you get to think again in terms of, all right, down to the most minute level, each loop. What's the trigger? What's the engaging activity? What's the feedback? What's the investment? So down to the most granular level, what loops and arcs allow us to do, or challenge us to do, is to break down that broad goal into minor arcs and then into individual tasks, individual loops that not only map out the investment and give feedback, but are all aimed towards that same goal, that commitment to moving students to mastery. So what does that look like? It's loops connected together, sometimes parallel. If you remember from our previous webinar, we talked about the fact that sometimes a skill needs to be repeated. So it's not always going to immediately move to the next level of difficulty. If it's challenging enough, you may need them to repeat the same thing over and over again. but eventually you're moving them to another level of proficiency that's moving them forward. This is an example of a minor arc, linking these loops together so that they accomplish an intermediate goal, and then connecting that minor arc to the next one. And that can go on, not indefinitely, because remember that all of this is linked towards a broad major goal, which either could be graduation or transfer or whatever your goal is. But the idea is that progression scheme maps out into very tactical steps. It breaks that big goal down into the most specific steps that allow you to show how what a student is being asked to do is allowing them to feel a sense of progress and move them to mastery. So what are the key takeaways? And this is just, again, a reminder from the last episode that when it comes to loops, that's the smallest unit of analysis. It's the smallest unit of your game design approach is always going to be the loop. That's where it starts. And when you're designing a loop and you're creating a loop as a part of your bigger design model, a loop is one task at a time. So that engaging activity that we saw at the top, that one section of the loop, it's one engaging activity. It's not 5. If you have 5 different activities that you know or believe a student needs to engage in, now we're talking about an arc. You need to link those together. So it's the repeatable tasks. It's the importance of repetition, which we covered in the last episode. That is our starting point. Then we connect them together to stimulate arousal. So you want to think it's not just random activities. That's why the anatomy of a loop is not just any activity, it's engaging activity. The activity needs to be engaging, and the sequence with which the activities are connected should also be connected deliberately so that they stimulate arousal. So if we think of it within the context of the flow model, it's got to balance challenge with skill. Can't be too hard, too fast. Can't be too easy, too long. That's your challenge of how you're connecting those loops into arcs. And the secondary or the complementary goal is that you want to sustain investment en route to mastery. So thinking about how those activities connect together in a way that keeps that player, our student, in that channel of flow is what gets them to continue to invest. The sustained investment is what's moving them up and to the right on the path to mastery. And finally, it all starts with remembering that everyone starts at a point of apathy. They all start not knowing what needs to be done and potentially not caring about what needs to be done. And so the task is both to educate and to engage, to get them to know, see it's possible to complete, and want to take the next step. Just the next step. It's one real important trick. Don't try to start at the beginning with, you really ought to want to have this goal at the end of 4 years or the end of 3 years. That's too far ahead. That is what game designers understand really well. Actually, what I want to do is keep you engaged enough that you'll complete the next loop. And if I can get you to start and then complete the next loop, then my goal for that loop is to get you to go to the next loop. It's just one step after another. Some plateaus, some sort of major transition points, and we'll talk about that next week when we talk about zero-sum gaming. But the idea is that there's a systematic progress to keep them moving to mastery. So, questions, comments, please share them. Whether you post them now during the live webinar, which I'll definitely check. If there are any before we sign off, I will answer them on air. If not, on our broadcast page, the comment section is perpetual, so you can come back at any point when you're watching this video, whether it's now or at some point in the future, and post a comment, and the feedback will continue and the dialogue will continue. I hope that you're trying this out. I hope that you are playing around. Oops, excuse me. I mean to do that, yeah. I hope that you're playing around with our model and looking at ways that this could be applied to what you want to do, because that's the point. It does not matter what your goal is for your students. Again, you can be an educator and think about the best way to design the content you're sharing. along these principles, or you could be a program director trying to get more students to take advantage of your student organization or the tutoring program or supplemental instruction or any number of things any number of opportunities, I should say, that exist on every college campus. As an educator myself, that's one of the things that I always find challenging, frustrating, but ultimately rewarding when we can be successful. We know that the resources are on campus for students. We know that on just about any college campus, there is a resource that can help them achieve what their goal for college is. One of our biggest hurdles is just connecting them to those resources and getting them to stick with it long enough for them to experience the benefits. And if nothing else, to me, that's the greatest promise of game design for student success. It's actually giving you a template to think this through and then test it, try it out, see, does A lead to B and B lead to C? And so you have that canvas, you have these principles that we're covering. I encourage you to try it out, play with it. And as you try out some ideas, come back and share it as a part of this informal community that we're creating around game design for student success. In our next webinar in the series, which will be next week, we will cover non-zero-sum gaming. And as a very, very, very quick, brief tease preview, what that refers to is non-zero-sum is contrasted with zero-sum games. Zero-sum games are games where someone has to win and someone has to lose. What we're going to talk about are thinking about the project or process that you want to design, applying a non-zero-sum approach to it, meaning that there don't have to be winners and losers, that everyone who participates plays. There are plenty of games for which that is true. We're going to go through those examples. We're going to show how that applies to higher education. And we will, for the first time, start talking about mechanics. So in the kickoff, I talked about the difference between design and game design and game mechanics. And in this webinar and the webinar before, when we talked about loops and arcs, we just talked about design principles. But obviously, there are mechanics, and mechanics are useful once you know about how to use them deliberately in design. So in our next webinar, we're actually going to start talking about mechanics now that you have the core elements of design under your belt, or at least have been exposed to them. We'll start talking about specific mechanics, which ones to use, which ones not to use, and how to integrate them into your plan, integrate them into your loops, so that your design starts coming together. So I hope you will join me for that, join us for that, and post any questions in the meantime that you have. If there are no other questions, which doesn't look like we have, I thank you again for joining us for this webinar on game design for student success, and look forward to talking to you in our next webinar session.